Piers Morgan had Nick Fuentes on after flirting with the idea for weeks, and it was definitely more contentious than how Tucker Carlson, or quite frankly, anyone else handled an interview with Nick Fuentes. Cenk, what are your 2 cents? What are you expecting?
Look, I mean, we haven't had Fuentes on either, but this whole not talking to each other is silly. So do I like that Piers Morgan had him on? Sure. Let's have that conversation. Let's expose the ideas we don't agree with, which we're going to talk about here. We're allowed to agree with people who generally we are very much in disagreement with on other issues. Let's just have that conversation. So let's watch these clips here and have an adult talk about it.
So Fuentes gets a lot of attention for his comments and his takes on US support for Israel. And they did get into that discussion about halfway through the nearly 2-hour-long interview. But since everyone's gonna be focusing on that, and we have covered that before in other contexts, I wanted to focus on other elements of this conversation that I thought were interesting and somewhat surprising. So Piers Morgan began the interview by reciting what Fuentes said about his own father and whether his father's views of the world have contributed to Fuentes's worldview. Let's take a look.
You talked about your father, Bill Fuentes, and how he wouldn't take the family, including you, to certain restaurants because he believed they were associated with African Americans. We would be deciding where to go to eat, you said. What are we going to do for dinner tonight? It was a running joke. Me and my sister would say Applebee's, and my dad would say we would never eat at Applebee's. Not in a million years should you be caught dead, Fuentes said about Applebee's. Go to a different restaurant, a local restaurant, no Applebee's, no Red Lobster, that is commonly known as black fare. Do you think you grew up in a racist environment, that your father was inherently racist, and that thought process moved to you?
Well, I would say it's a new low. I've been attacked for being a racist many times, but to attack my father, to attack my parents based on anecdotes, I would say that's sort of a new low.
Hang on, it's your anecdote.
Yeah, but he's not here to defend himself.
You are. It's a reasonable question.
Yeah, no, like I said, I think everybody knows what that is, but I'll address it. I'll engage with it, and I'll defend my father from the charge of racism.
Sure.
No, my parents are not racist, and they've never been racist. I'll tell you about my parents. They used to have a school in Chicago in the South Loop where they instructed people on how to shoot firearms. It was a security school, and most of the clients were black.
So he's gonna answer a little more in the next clip, but I wanted to show Piers Morgan's question and ask you, Cenk, whether you think that was a fair question to ask of Nick Fuentes.
Look, I wouldn't have gone in that direction. I think it's superfluous. I don't really care what his dad thinks. On the other hand, I'm also not outraged by the question. So what? Answer the question, right? And he did. But look, here's an anecdote I've told on the show, and then let's decide if that's racist, right? So they mentioned Red Lobster. Look, I don't know that Red Lobster is particularly black. I don't know what that means, right? But I have talked. First of all, Red Lobster has excellent cheese biscuits, and you should go.
No, but Red Lobster is delicious. No, hold on. Like that is. I'm offended by the notion that you shouldn't eat it. Like we're not at all, sponsored by Red Lobster. This is an organic plug, I guess. I love Red Lobster. It is delicious.
Yeah. But I've kidded around about, sometimes I'll go to a diner or a restaurant and if I see either cops or black people there, I think nailed it. Because they actually.
The food's gonna be good.
Food's gonna be good, right?
Oh yeah.
So, but that's a funny little anecdote. It doesn't mean that I'm racist against white people and non-cops. So that's why, this is a little bit of a waste of time. We should get to Nick Fuentes' opinions. I don't mean us, I mean Piers starting with that. It seems needlessly hostile.
I agree. I think opening with a question about Nick Fuentes' dad is kind of weird, especially considering the fact that Nick Fuentes streams for hours on end each day. And if you wanna, actually focus on what Nick Fuentes himself has said about his own views, that would be more interesting. But nonetheless, he did answer the question. Let's go to his answer and then we'll move on.
What my parents would say if they were here is that for many, many years, the older generations of black people were very respectful, very humble, very decent. In fact, my grandma used to have an anecdote. She grew up in a lot of dysfunction. Her mother was mentally ill. and they would be having dinner in the projects, and there'd be so much chaos and dysfunction and disagreement and fighting. And she would look across the way out the window at a black family in the other apartment, and they'd be holding hands around the table saying grace. And this is sort of the culture that used to prevail. But now what you have in the city is that there's no accountability for the black people. And now Chicago has become a complete dump because these teenagers go out and they take over the city. They call them teen takeovers. That's the euphemism for it. They're teenagers, but they all come from the same neighborhood. They drive up there and they mug people and attack people, and they destroy cars and destroy shops.
Okay, so that now we're starting to get into, the territory of what Nick Fuentes actually thinks about the black community, and he's gonna, weigh in on that a lot more in upcoming clips, including I think one of the most devastating clips that Piers Morgan played of Nick Fuentes in one of his rants. But before we get to that, Cenk, what are your thoughts on how he answered that?
Yeah, look, I feel like we're constantly stuck in the middle in this way. So are there crime issues in some of the bigger cities? Yeah. By the way, crime's gotten much better in the last year and a half or so. But if you want to address that, no problem. If you want to make it racial, what's the point? What does it solve, right? So are there issues that affect people in lower socioeconomic classes that affect both blacks, whites, Latinos the same? Yes. And blaming it on one particular race is not that helpful at all. And there he was talking about what was wrong with his own culture, and then he trips to what's now wrong with black culture. But I don't think those are the issue at all. I think class is the issue in that particular case. And so I think he's misdiagnosing the problem pretty significantly.
Yeah, okay, so with that in mind, let's actually just go to the next clip, because this is the one that, caught my attention the most.
They're always coming up with, no, it's not the Jews. No, it's not women. No, it's not blacks. It's actually really complicated. No, it isn't at all. Jews are running society. Women need to shut the up. Blacks need to be imprisoned for the most part. And we would live in paradise. It's that simple.
Okay. Would you like to clarify what you meant there?
That's all true. That's 100% true. Everything I said in that clip is true.
Including that blacks need to be imprisoned for the most part.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, all of them?
No, for the most part.
What does the most part mean? What percentage of American blacks would you like to see in prison?
Whatever the percentages of the murderers. I think it's 1 in 20 black men will commit a murder in their lifetime. So maybe let's say that 5%.
Oh, so you're talking about black people who murder people?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But you didn't say that. You just said blacks need to be imprisoned for the most part. You didn't clarify that you were talking about black murderers.
Right.
Okay, so now they're about to debate actual, per capita homicide numbers broken down by race, and they're actually both wrong. So stay tuned for that. But I mean, he just owns it, right? So he listens to that video of himself, not just going after black people, going after women, going after, various groups of people based on their identity, essentially lumping them all together as, a stereotype. And when he has an opportunity to say, no, there's more context on that, or no, let me explain what I meant, he just kind of owned it. So this is the thing about Fuentes and then his supporters as well. Because whenever you just say what he says he is, right? When he says that he's an anti-Semite, or when he says, that he thinks, most black people should be imprisoned, and then he has an opportunity to clarify whether he actually believes it, and he says, yeah, I believe it, and doubles down. Why do you guys get upset with people who clearly just repeat what Nick Fuentes says of himself?
Yeah, that's the part I don't understand, Anna. I feel like both Fuentes and his supporters kind of have to make up their mind.
Yeah.
Are you guys avowedly and excitedly racist, sexist, etc., or are you not, right? And I don't mind either. You just tell me. But so that clip of Fuentes is by definition racist and sexist, right? And those are terms we don't like here. There's way too many identity politics being played, and it's usually distract you from the great American robbery where the donors are robbing you blind. But what is that? I mean, if you're saying arrest black murderers, why are you even putting the qualifier black? Why don't we arrest all murderers? right? So, but you didn't say that in the beginning. And in fact, Piers almost bailed him out there. No, he said imprison a great percentage of black people. So now, if you're in that camp, do you think black people are going to agree with you? That's absurd, right? Do you think women, 51% of the country, are going to agree that they should all shut up? So that it's okay, you have whatever you have, opinions you have, it's a free country, right? But then don't come and say pretend you're the victims. And I can't believe anybody called me sexist when I said all women should shut up.
So yeah, look, I obviously the idea that most black people should be in prison is disgusting, and I disagree with it wholeheartedly. The point that Fuentes, I think, is trying to make is that when it comes to homicides, the perpetrators who carry that out are unfortunately disproportionately black. And it's an uncomfortable statistic to bring up, but both he and Piers Morgan got the numbers wrong. In fact, both he and Piers Morgan thought the numbers were much higher than they really are. So they debate the numbers. You heard Fuentes in that last video say that he thinks that 1 in 10 black men commit murder. Okay, which is insane.
It's insane.
It is insane. But then Piers Morgan tries to correct him and says that the real number is 1 in 100, which is also insane. So he's misinterpreting numbers. I don't think that Piers Morgan is racist. I just think that he's misinterpreting the studies and the numbers. So I looked into this, and I think he's referencing a study in JAMA that was actually released in February of this year. The study was conducted by Paula Strassel from the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of Maryland. And here's what the study found. We can put the graph up on the screen, and on the far right side, you have whites represented. In the middle is where you have, black individuals who have carried out homicides represented. Okay, so in the data set that's being studied here is between the year 2000 and 2019, and the homicide rate for black males ages 15 through 24 was around 74.6 per 100,000 population, or about 1 in 1,340 men in that age group specifically. Now that age group tends to, young men in general tend to be more aggressive, tend to, be more likely to act violently, right? So that's why you see that age group, overrepresented even within the various demographics or identities we're talking about here. And then there are years where the numbers are even worse, reaching as high as 101.5 per 100,000 in 2023. For black males aged 24 to 44, the rate was around 70 per 100,000. And then keep in mind that the researcher isn't just relying on raw numbers here, right? Putting this in a per capita perspective helps you kind of understand what the realities are in terms of which demographics are more likely to carry out this particular crime, which happens to be homicide and murder. So those are just the facts. I'm not making anything up, and I'm basing this on a study that was published just this year.
Yeah, look, when you have at worst case scenario 1 out of 1,340, and you say it's majority instead, which implies 600-700, right? No, that's not right. It's just not factually correct. And yeah, that is what leads to racism. So look, I've used this analogy before because Turks are such a rando ethnicity here in America that it helps clarify things. So do Turks in Germany have a higher crime rate than Turks in America? Yes. Why? Does it have anything to do with them being Turkish? No, because more day laborers, blue collar guys go to Germany from Turkey because they could drive there. And so they're lower socioeconomic status. Turks in America happen to be pretty well off. So the crime rate is nearly non-existent. So this is a socioeconomic issue, and you see it playing out across all the races here in America as well. So on the one hand, sometimes people deny the numbers, and that's not helpful, right? So are you going to get a higher percentage of per capita of African Americans that commit more crime here in America? Yes. Why is that? Because of socioeconomic conditions. And one last rando Turkish one. Tell the story of near the Syrian border in Turkey, where my parents grew up. An explosion of crime happened. Why? Because there's these absurd laws about tariffs, and they made a lot of money by ignoring the tariffs. and doing smuggling across the border. Why did they do it? Because they were all poor. It wasn't like, oh my God, some breakout of immorality happened near the Syrian border. No, these are just normal things that happen in life, and you shouldn't ignore them, and you should also figure out what the real causes are instead of just blaming people in a blanket way. One last thing, Anna, when it comes to Israel, same thing. The media will say, no, there are no donors that favor Israel, but that's not true at all. Of course there are. And they give hundreds of millions of dollars, and they say that doesn't affect politicians. That's absurd. Of course it affects politicians. Does that mean all Jews are part of a global scheme? It's no. Most Jews, the overwhelming majority of Jewish Americans, have normal jobs and normal lives and have nothing to do with Israel or the IDF or anything like that. So that's why these generalizations based on the wrong characteristics and focusing on the wrong traits of people doesn't help at all. Sometimes you'll identify the right problem and have a very wrong solution.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.